Okay, I think we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third Meet Your Program Officer webinar. Today, we'll be discussing two program officers will be presenting on their areas. My name is Rachel Pardo, and I am a program officer here at the Trust, and I will be your MC today. Before I hand it over to my colleagues, I wanted to go over a few logistics. First of all, everyone is muted, and your video should be disabled. If that is not the case, please make sure that you are muted and your video is disabled before we begin. If you have any questions during the question and answer section or at any time during the presentation, you can ask those via the chat box, and I will be reading those throughout the presentation. I will select some to ask the program officers during the presentation, and we'll go over others at the end. The webinar will last an hour. It is being recorded, and we can also make the slides available for whoever is interested. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Swann, who is the Vice President for Grants, to introduce our presenters. Swann?
Thanks, Rachel, so much. I really just want to start by saying thank you to all of you who have dialed in today. We really appreciate you taking this time with us, particularly given the current state of our city and the world. And we also really want to thank you and your organizations for everything that you have done and continue to do and will continue to do to keep New Yorkers safe, healthy, housed, fed, and supported in so many ways. So you guys are doing heroic work, and we are deeply grateful and appreciative of you. I'm Swann Moorhead, but today you're really here to meet two program officers from the Trust and learn about their areas of grant making. So I am joined today not only by Rachel, but Patricia Swann. Patricia has been at the Trust for about 20 years, and she is joined by Arturo Garcia-Costas. Arturo has been here with us at the Trust for 7 years. And they are very much looking forward to talking with you about their areas of focus and programs. Both Pat and Arturo will talk about their areas of grant making. And then once they've done that, we will talk generally about the Trust proposal review process and answer any questions you have about that. And then look at some things we often get asked and try to anticipate those and answer them for you. And then we'll close out, of course, with plenty of time for questions and answers from you. And I do know Pat and Arturo are both planning to break in a couple of points to leave room for questions as well. So please don't be shy. And again, thank you all so much. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pat to get us started on substance.
Okay, thank you, Swann. So I am responsible for 3 different grant areas here at the Trust: community development, technical assistance or nonprofit capacity building, and civic affairs. So I'll start with community development. As you can see on the slide, there are 3 overarching goals that our board has approved for our community development grant area. It focuses on affordable housing, both advocacy and direct services, and also community-based economic development, again, also advocacy and direct services. It's important for me to point out that community-based economic development does not include workforce development or job training, as we have a separate grant-making area specifically for that is headed by my colleague Roderick Jenkins. But for us, community-based economic development does include things like revitalization of neighborhood commercial strips and micro-enterprise development and support for small neighborhood businesses. A few examples of recent grants in our community development area would include things like preserving privately owned rent-regulated apartment buildings, stabilizing low-income homeowners, including owners of limited equity cooperatives, community land trust, engaging public housing residents in preservation and community development strategies, and encouraging partnerships, consolidations, and alliances among community development organizations when there is a duplication of service. So next slide, please. I'll talk next about technical assistance. And again, you can see on the slide the 3 overarching goals for that grant area. So naturally, technical assistance, meaning any kind of management assistance or support for the infrastructure of a nonprofit organization that's not directly connected to a specific program or project. And at any given time, it would be impossible for us to directly support all of the organizations in New York City and all of their management assistance needs. So most of our technical assistance grants go to nonprofits that serve other nonprofits with management assistance in accordance with these 3 priority goals. So technical assistance provider organizations that we consistently support include Cause Effective, Support Center for Nonprofit Management, Community Resource Center, Lawyers Alliance for New York. We have also supported from time to time several other organizations, including Governance Matters, Catch a Fire, Fiscal Management Associates, and Nonprofit Finance Fund, which we recently supported through our COVID Impact and Relief Fund. And we have also been the lead funder over the past several years for 2 programs that we co-designed with the grantees. One is the Nonprofit Excellence Awards with Nonprofit New York, formerly known as the Nonprofit Coordinating Committee, and the Leadership Fellows Program with Baruch College. In addition to these grants, the individual program officers, my colleagues, also will occasionally do smaller grants to individual grantees for a discrete, time-limited capacity building project. Examples might include to bring on a consultant to help redesign a database, or for a board-driven strategic planning process, or for a leadership transition plan, an executive leadership transition. So these smaller grants are capped at $20,000, and they typically are used to help pay for consultants' fees. And so in that way, in addition to supporting the network of TA provider organizations in the city, we're also able to support the city's rich network of independent nonprofit consultants. So next slide, please. The third area I'll talk about is civic affairs. And you could see the 3 goals on the screen. They are pretty straightforward. I'd like to focus a little bit on the second goal, to make local and state government more accountable, because this goal covers various types of government functions beyond elections. Elections are the obvious way to make government accountable, but we also get involved in other aspects of government function. So recent examples of grants under this category would be educating people about the budget process, and in some cases getting people actually involved in the form of participatory budgeting. We've also done grants that advocate for community involvement in land use and zoning decisions, another very important government function. And of course, as most of you know, this year was a census year. And so the census being a very important government function, we devoted a lot of resources over the past 3 years actually to the census, to census outreach and census education. And we've done that primarily through the donor collaborative that we call the New York State Census Equity Fund. And that fund will soon be shifting into making grants around the issue of redistricting, which is yet another very important function of government. Finally, I want to emphasize that encouraging civic participation among specific constituencies especially those that are disconnected from the political process, is a priority, and activities in that area might include organizing candidate forums, voter registration drives, or encouraging young people to get involved in the political process and to vote. But these projects must be operated in accordance with best practices for nonpartisan voter engagement. That's because it's at the risk of stating the obvious, we do not support any projects that promote a candidate or a political party. For example, a voter registration drive that targets a specific district or neighborhood will not be considered because it's possible that it could be skewed, whether deliberately or not, to favor a specific candidate. For that reason, we rarely do voter engagement projects that are highly localized in a geographic way. And so this is a very different approach from our community development grant making. And so I think I'll pause here in case Rachel has questions from the audience on anything that I've said so far.
No questions from the audience, so I think we can go ahead.
Okay, so I will hand it off at this point to my colleague, Arturo Garcia-Costas, and he will talk about national and international environment grant making. Arturo?
And local, Pat. Thanks, thanks, Pat. So as sort of Pat sort of intimated, I handle all things environmental for the Trust, as well as managing a fund that focuses on helping the coal-impacted communities of Central Appalachia. However, since the Appalachia program is an invitation-only opportunity, I'll be focusing this morning on our environmental grant making, focusing on New York City and our national and international environment program. As one of the oldest and largest community foundations in the country, we are essentially a place-based, place-focused funder. However, the Trust has a distinction of having a handful of programs with a broader scope. One of these is our national and international environment program, through which we support statewide, regional initiatives, as well as those that have a national or even global focus. That means that our environmental grant making requires us to think strategically and deeply about the benefits that community gardens brings to their neighborhoods and the need to green the global finance system. Even at the national and global scales, however, we try to bring a place-based perspective to our grant making in this policy arena by emphasizing things such as the leadership of cities and states, as well as communities on the front lines of the climate crisis and other thorny environmental challenges. We are also one of the few foundations that will support litigation and lobbying. Both activities have figured prominently in our environmental grant making over the past few years. You can get an inkling of the breadth and depth of the Trust's environmental investments by looking at the 4 strategic priorities listed on this slide. Clearly, whether it's environmental health or climate and energy, each one of these priorities encompasses a range of possible worthwhile initiatives, especially at the different levels of governance. I often suggest to grant seekers that they take a look at our press releases that we do for every board meeting for the last couple years to ensure that something that they're submitting doesn't have too much of an overlap with something that the Trust currently has funded or has recently funded. One note on internationally focused grants. Because we only have a handful of those in play at any one time, we tend to focus on partnering with multilateral organizations or large international nonprofits or networks that are working in multiple countries or regionally. Sometimes it's worthwhile to reach out to me if you're thinking of submitting something that's internationally focused for me to give you a bit of a read as to whether it might be considered. So generally our board, we do our grant making based on a strategy. and our board approved a strategy for our national and international environment program in 2014. I really recommend you to visit our website and download that strategy. I believe that Rachel is going to put the link into the chat box for you to do that. Because you'll really get a good sense of the kind of principles and approaches that animate our national and international environmental grant making. So I'm going to move on to our city work. Our national environmental grant making is solely supported by the Henry Philip Craft Family Memorial Fund, which was established at the Trust in 1996. The Craft Fund is an example of a permanent fund. To establish such a fund, someone donates money to the Trust, most often in their will. It is then invested, and the interest from the principal is used for grant making focused on a particular field of interest. Our NYC environment program is supported by a number of such permanent funds, many of which are focused on the parks and green spaces that make the city work. Examples include the Bellotti Fund, which supports community gardens in the South Bronx, the Sarah and Harry Rogers Fund, which helps us fund stewardship activities in city parks, and the Hijaz Tree Fund, which helps nonprofits take care of our precious urban forest. We also have funds focused on things such as promoting renewable energy and protecting the city's air and water. Whether it is our decade-long support for congestion pricing or our investment in reforming the city's commercial waste system to stop thousands of unnecessary truck trips through our streets every evening, or our current support for the rapid expansion of community solar across the 5 boroughs, the Trust's environmental grant making is focused on making New York City a national and global leader in urban sustainability and climate resilience. If you'd like to see the full NYC environment strategy, I believe that Rachel will also post that link in the chat. So I encourage you to take a look at that. So at this stage, I will stop for any questions that you might have about the substance of our national international environment program or our NYC environment program.
We don't have any questions as of right now. I just wanted to clarify that the link I put on the chat box is actually a link to all of our strategies. So you can see the drop down for our environment as well as the program areas that Pat discussed today, or any of our program areas that we're not going over. There are no questions for the environmental program right now. A few came in for Pat after we moved on, so it's okay. I'll ask Pat some of those. One question is whether we support supported housing, whether we can support that under our community development funding.
Supportive housing is generally supported via our different program area, which we call human services. However, there are many cases and instances where different projects have one foot in one program area and another foot in the other, and supportive housing is certainly one area that fits that description. So I have from time to time collaborated with colleagues in support of a project or program that addresses some aspects of affordable housing through a supportive housing strategy.
And the other question that came in for you, Pat, was about whether you would support initiatives that provide opportunities for civic engagement and voter registration for teens under a teen leadership program. I think this goes back to kind of a collaboration with our other program officers and how we do that at the Trust. So whether you would support something under your program areas.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. We've recently done a couple of youth-themed voter participation projects, in recognition of the importance of the young generation and getting them informed and engaged in voting. So yes.
Okay, thank you. And so for Arturo, are there any particular priorities for New York State? Climate, the law implementation?
Well, we were very instrumental. We supported the recent passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which heralds sort of a sea change in how the city approaches climate, or the state approaches climate change. The nature of that law is going to touch on a whole range of things, from agriculture to housing to energy to community development to natural resource management. So we are focused at the moment on implementation of that law and looking at different ways how that law is going to play out in different sectors. So it's one of the areas that I'm looking at going forward over the next couple of years when it comes to statewide initiatives.
Okay. Are alternative food production practices and meat alternatives part of your grant portfolio to address climate change?
We actually did a grant last year to an organization called Plant Pure Communities that focused on the need to begin shifting away from a meat-based diet. So that has been part of our grant making. Generally, though, in our national program, we're looking at issues of regenerative agriculture and how regenerative agriculture can play a role in addressing climate change, can play a role in environmental health, and in a whole slew of other environmental areas.
Okay. Is funding focused on spaces, such as gardens and greenways, or does it also support consultants that develop greening and community engagement plans for greening urban areas, such as abandoned lots or rooftops?
Yeah, so the answer to that is kind of both. Because of the nature, as I sort of talked about in our New York City environment program, we have a lot of funds that focus on a particular issue, like the, as I said, the Hijaz Tree Fund focuses on trees and shrubs and taking care of trees and shrubs in the city. But we also have other funds that can be used and have been used for more of a planning purpose. I have the real distinct pleasure of often doing co-funding with Pat on several things. And we did a grant together to the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, which really focuses on how to limit the combined sewer overflows that affect that waterway by greening the area around it with green infrastructure, with sponge parks and various other mechanisms. So that one involved a lot of planning. It was kind of a master plan that nonprofit was working on. And then they're taking that master plan and using it as an advocacy tool in their conversations with the city, and also as an organizing tool in their conversations with the residents of that area and with other nonprofits.
This person is a little bit confused about the grant support provided to New York City, how New York City is different for the grant support that's provided on a national scale. So the question is whether the New York City focused work could also be available for initiatives throughout the country. So I guess if the strategy is different for New York City and national in terms of the type of work you're supporting.
Yeah, the strategy is a little different. When you look at the strategy, you see that they're a little different, but that they are a little different. But it's quite often that I am able to sort of blend those two strategies and those two budgets, essentially, because we have a budget, as I mentioned, our national program is funded by one fund, the Craft Fund, and our New York City budget is funded by a number of different permanent funds and some unrestricted money. So if you have a project that's submitted that, for example, focuses on the tri-state area or that focuses on New York State, but also has a significant focus on New York City, we are able to put some resources from our national program into that, as well as some resources from our New York City environment budget. The most important thing to think about in that circumstance is essentially if most of the budget is focused statewide, then it would come through our national program. If most of the budget and most of the activities are focused on New York City, it would come through our New York City program.
And I guess the last question is that your goals are fairly broad, and I think this is the case essentially for all of our program areas. Can we talk a little bit about how we prioritize projects? We're going to get into a lot about how we prioritize and how we evaluate proposals that come in later on. So there are some more questions that are pretty specific in terms of various ideas and areas that we support. So I want to move on just so that we can talk about a little bit more of our general grant making. And I will share these chat questions with the program officers if they can follow up. And we might have time to answer some of these at the end of the program as well. Okay?
Great, Rachel. I actually think that last question is a good entree to our next slide, which talks about the different submission and review processes that exist for the National Environmental Program and for our NYC Environment Program and other NYC-focused programs at the Trust. The most important thing to understand is that the national program and those NYC programs have two different processes and are on different cycles, essentially. Pat's going to cover the open application process for NYC-focused proposals in a moment, since it's the same for nearly all the Trust programs. But first, I'm going to cover the two-step process that we use for our national environmental grant making. Essentially, in 2016, we shifted to a two-step process, mainly because before that, only about 1/4 of the proposals that were submitted to the national program led to a grant recommendation. And we didn't like the fact that we were
Once you submit a proposal, the organization receives an automated email from us that goes directly to the paid staff head as indicated on the proposal cover sheet. You'll also get an official notice of a decline of a proposal. In both cases, all emails are sent to the organization's paid staff head as identified in the proposal cover sheet. We've heard that these emails sometimes get caught in spam filters, so we advise you and anybody involved in the proposal writing process for your organization to be sure to include no reply, one word, no reply at nycommunitytrust.org in your address book. One other thing to note is that we as a team decide who a proposal will be assigned to. So that is not something that you as an applicant need to determine in advance. You'll be notified when your proposal is assigned, but the email will not tell you which program officer or officers are working on it. So next slide, please. Once a proposal is assigned, the program officers complete a full review of the proposal. Arturo will go over our full review process later on, but briefly, program officers assess the quality of the proposed project. They ascertain whether it's a sound approach that meets a need and is not duplicative of other projects. They look to see whether the activities described will actually address the stated issue and if this makes sense within the context of the field. They look at the organization's finances and governance and whether it has the capability to carry out the project. And they assess the project's relevance to our grant-making guidelines, which Arturo and I outlined earlier, the guidelines for our respective programs. At this point, the program officer will decide if the project merits further investigation. If so, they will schedule meetings and/or site visits. We generally only conduct site visits with organizations we are seriously considering for funding. And of course, meetings and site visits all being done virtually for the foreseeable future. If the proposal does not merit further investigation, we'll decline it. All declines are reviewed internally before applicants are notified.
You should include concrete details on how and why the organization requesting support is best suited to carry out the activities to help build a case. This includes not only demonstrating a deep knowledge of the field, but also financial and governance stability. On governance issues, I'd like to note that we use the Better Business Bureau as a starting point when we are looking at governance standards. And the Better Business Bureau includes the notion of an independent board, where you don't have more than 2 related members that are related to each other by blood or marriage on the board, and that there's at least 5 unpaid or 5 board members, 4 of which should be unpaid at least. So did I miss a slide here? Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped over to, did I skip over, Rachel, the systems change one?
Yeah, I believe you did.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I think we should move ahead because we're kind of short on time. So if we want to move on to the next section.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you, Arturo. I'm going to talk a little bit about budgets. All program officers complete a thorough review of the organizational and project budget, as well as additional financial materials such as audits and 990s as a part of the proposal review process. I'm going to go through a few pointers about our budget requirements. Budgets should reflect all the anticipated cost of carrying out the gaps or surpluses. If a cost is not discussed in the narrative, it should not be included in the budget, and vice versa. If there is a line item in the budget that's not reflected in the narrative, that for me is a problem. And the budget should reflect the full amount of the project's cost, not just the grant. Lastly, budgets should not include portions of every or almost every staff's time, because this would be construed as a request for general operating support. Next slide, please. So this is an example. This is a sample budget for a single organization. A budget for a collaborative or a coalition will look very different. But as you can see, the expenses are separated as per standard budgeting format into personnel, program-related expenses, and administrative cost. Note that the personnel line item includes fringe and benefits for the identified staff. The program costs include everything that's needed to successfully complete the program or project, and may also include program equipment such as iPads to gather data, for example, consultants, food or honoraria for attendees, etc. Again, please note that we include administrative or overhead cost as a reasonable percentage of the overall budget. The income side lists all of the projected and secured income from private foundations and government. It can also include fees, reimbursements, donations, and in-kind support. Note that the anticipated trust grant is reflected here in projected income. We will ask you how you plan to fill a budget gap, if there is one. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is a question that we get a lot. What is the difference between an organizational budget?
Existing grantees submit an application for a different portfolio while maintaining current funding.
So the answer to that is yes, you can submit a request. I will say that because as the community foundation, we aim to support as many of the city's nonprofits as we have resources to be able to do. Rarely make multiple grants to the same agency in the same period of time, right? So if you have an open grant, it doesn't mean no way to the new application for a different project, but it is unlikely.
Okay, a question about, though we don't support films, would we support campaigns for outreach and engagement and an educational campaign that is associated with the film or other project that we may not necessarily support?
So that's probably a better question for Salim, our arts program officer, but my instinct on that is that if it is a campaign around a single film or outreach around a single film, probably not.
Swann, may I? Though we have in the past, if a film is incorporated into a broader advocacy campaign that's focusing on systems change, and that's one element of that campaign, we have supported that. But as Swann just said, if the film is the primary thing, I think that would be unlikely to be competitive.
Yes, I agree.
Would the trust consider supporting civic engagement for particular marginalized communities, in this case, LGBTQ communities?
Yes, is the short answer. Yes, as long as, again, as I mentioned before, civic